welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peters, and now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got a great podcast for you. We're going to be joined here in segments number 1 and 2 by Riley Frain. He does such great work over at the Portal Report, Mid-Major Madness, and so much more. Here in the first few minutes, we're going to highlight what we have seen this week out of LSU, the good, the bad, the ugly, the strange. It has been a wild week for them, to say the least, so we're going to be touching upon that. And then more in part 2, we're going to be looking at these NBA draft decisions. We're going to be looking at these teams that may be going into the transfer portal with regards to what happens with some of these NBA draft decisions as well. So we're going to be highlighting that with them. In the final segment, we did see some teams pick up some guys in the transfer portal. I will be recapping those news and notes. Unlike the last few days, we didn't have a bombshell from LSU here on Thursday, so that's why you're getting a little bit of a two-part chat here with our good friend Riley. And if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, LarsCM, the name does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way, that is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it's very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. Let's waste no more time and get out to our man Riley. He is doing such a tremendous job looking at this great sport of college basketball over at a pair of great places, Mid-Major Madness. Obviously, that's involved in the mid-majors, and this time of year, he does a great job looking at the entire scope over at the Portal Report, where they're locked in on all these guys. And while a lot of the roster spots have been filled, there's still those guys that are still looming out there, the old guys that fall through the cracks, that sometimes they become diamonds for teams. So there's still a lot to be sorted out there. Riley is doing a great job on that front, and Riley, he's always dialed into the sport all 12 months out of the year. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X at his first and last name, Riley Frain, and the last name is spelled Frain. And Riley, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, Greg. Thank you for having me. You're right. It is always a pleasure getting to hop on here with you, talk a little bit of college basketball. It seems like we have a new, interesting subject every time I come on, and today's no different. I know the transfer portal slowing down, but definitely still a lot of crazy, interesting stuff going around the sport in general. So excited to dive into some of it.
Absolutely. I am as well. And Riley, it has been wild what we've seen out of the last few days because we've got looming NBA draft decisions. We'll hit those a little bit later. But what do we make of the fact that LSU is looking, because if you've ever seen the movie The Benchwarmers, it's one of my favorites. They've got that old guy with the mustache that pulls out a $10 bill and a piece of paper that says, "I'm 12. It feels like that's the waiver that LSU is trying to put in for about half their roster for eligibility right now. They really didn't acquire a lot of guys via the transfer portal because instead, when you look at the On3 graphics, you've got NBA logos, which I never thought we would see, but here we are for a lot of these guys. They have signed multiple NBA draft picks. They're trying to bring back RJ Lewis. What do we make out of this? Because they've done a few guys legitimately, like Modi Abate. He should be eligible, so that's good news. But very interesting happenings here this past week for the LSU Tigers.
For sure, yeah. I mean, they definitely do still have some eligible guys. They did bring in a couple guys from the portal, too, who do have legit eligibility and what not have you. But it's funny because about probably a month ago, a couple weeks ago, maybe even a little more than that, we were kind of joking about LSU because they hadn't bought anyone in the portal, and everyone was sort of making fun of, Will Wade and the slow start that was going on over there at LSU in terms of the portal. And, now we kind of know why, but turns out they still end up being at the center of attention because, they're bringing in a handful of players from different places, whether it be here or I believe bringing in a couple guys who have played professionally in Europe as well, who are well past their college years and probably should be, a little beyond that eligibility-wise as well. The online negativity is definitely getting piled on LSU and Wade right now. Definitely a lot of people saying they feel like he's probably ruining the sport. It's the sport's not all about him. I think a lot of people feel like obviously it's meant to be able to showcase a lot of these college kids, and obviously he's making something of a mockery of it when you're bringing in 25, 26-year-old kids to compete with 21, 22-year-old guys who obviously do have college eligibility remaining. So yeah, a crazy situation. The NCAA is going to have to do some policing down the line here. I certainly don't have the answers myself. I can say with some confidence, Greg, that we definitely should not have 25, 26-year-olds playing college basketball pretty consistently outside of maybe some very specific niche cases. So, yeah, definitely some crazy things going on down in Baton Rouge, down at LSU. Yeah, definitely some sorting out that the NCAA and just the sport of college basketball in general has to do.
Yeah, when you've got guys that were drafted in the 2020 NBA draft getting moved around and they are going to college, when you got RJ Lewis, who we all talked about his NBA draft decision last year, being like, why the heck is he doing this? We all knew that it was a bad decision. He's got buyer's remorse there. Yeah, it's interesting to say the least. And do you think that this could pick up a little bit more momentum for that 5-5 rule that we've been talking about? Because I do feel like with LSU, they are, for lack of a better term, forcing the hand of the NCAA to not just pass that, but pass that very quickly.
I don't know if that was necessarily what they set out to do, bringing in some of these guys. I think it was just kind of the way they intended to go about building a roster in the current landscape. But yeah, to your point, Greg, I mean, if the NCAA were to sort of change things on the eligibility front with the 5-5 and stuff like that, LSU just might be SOL, for lack of a better term, in terms of a roster, because they just won't have a ton of guys to play, which, in the grand scheme of things, just because they've sort of been a little devious about this and, have gone out and are just recruiting as many guys as they can with professional experience and who probably shouldn't have eligibility, it feels like. So, maybe the NCAA should just say, hey, maybe we're not going to pass this 5-for-5 eligibility or extend the eligibility in any way. And so you just won't have a roster. Obviously, they'll find other ways to get guys in. It's LSU, and whether that be stealing transfers from different rosters or just bringing different guys up from other levels, whatever it may be. Obviously, LSU would find a way to build a roster, but, not an incredibly talented one this late in the window. So I think it would be interesting for the NCAA to maybe take a stance and say, hey, like, we're not going to let you abuse the rules. We're still figuring out this eligibility thing. Like, maybe they're not going to declare a lot of these guys eligible. So, we'll see how it plays out. Again, I don't really have any reason to believe the NCAA is going to take a major stance here. They haven't given us a ton of reason to believe that. And, we could dive into tournament expansion, and that's a whole other episode I'm sure we could do. But yeah, just the whole state of the sport right now, it's a little bit, it's tough. It's tough to look at, especially as a fan, a big proponent of mid-major, basketball and different things like that. So it's a crazy situation going on in LSU. We can go on and on and on. And in terms of eligibility, it feels like, they're certainly finding ways to skirt around it. And I'm interested to see, if the NCAA is willing to take a stand and, what they're going to do about it potentially.
Yep. And we saw this begin last year with the James Nanji situation, obviously Charles Bediako, and now it's a situation that's on steroids, to say the least, as our good friend, who I'm pretty sure is not juicing right now. That'd be Riley Frain, unless if that juice is orange juice, which we all approve on this podcast. He's joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, and no doubt there's a lot that's happening with LSU right now, but there's a lot happening with these NBA draft decisions as well. So I figured I would make this a two-part chat with Riley, hit upon LSU here, and now on the flip side, when we hit a break, we're going to be talking about these NBA draft decisions, these teams that might be looking at guys that pull out the NBA draft in the transfer portal. And I also want to chat with them about maybe a few teams here in the month of May that have made some moves that have went under the radar with what we've all seen out of LSU. That's on the flip side right here on Coast to Coast with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the Beats and Family Podcast. Side edge this college basketball season? Well, VSiN experts use CBB Analytics, the most comprehensive college basketball analytics platform in the world. See injury impact, on and off data, clutch time performance metrics, first versus second half splits, and so much more. Utilize the promo code of VSiN, that is VSIN, to get $30 off and find your betting edge over at cbbanalytics.com. That is cbbanalytics, all one word.com. For anyone that is new to VSiN, well, I wish you a friendly hello. This is an attention to anyone that is new to VSiN because you're able to get some free stuff with our daily newsletter. It's a great way to catch up on everything that's happening in the sports betting world. It's delivered straight to your inbox every single morning. VSiN's newsletter offers picks, data, strategies for the day's betting menu, and so much more. Sign up for free today over at VSiN.com/newsletter. That's VSIN.com/newsletter, and start receiving your free newsletter tomorrow morning. That is VSIN.com/newsletter. Stay ahead of the game and bet smarter with VSiN. We're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Always great to be joined by Riley Frain, who does such great work over at the Portal Report. Along with that, Mid-Major Madness. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X at his first and last name, Riley Frain. Last name is spelled Frain all together. And Riley, certainly in the first segment, we hit upon LSU, but there's more than just LSU happening in college basketball right now. Lost in the shuffle of all this, we have some big-time NBA draft decisions right now.
Sure.
And obviously a team like Vanderbilt with the Tanner situation. They've got a lot to gain/lose if Tyler Tanner returns there. But what guys are you looking at that could potentially enter in the portal? Are you really trying to gauge? Because I feel like there's a few of them. Obviously, Milan Misalovic, I think that's by far the biggest one. But there are a few others out there that I think get lost in the Milan hype.
Sure, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the other big name that jumps off the bat, because he was a big high major guy this past year and a former top 100 guy, Tunde Asuafu from Baylor, who had a fantastic freshman season. He started 34 games for, albeit a Baylor team that, not its best season in recent memory. They just finished 500 and struggled in the Big 12. But he comes out and has a fantastic freshman season. He's an interesting positional profile. He's 6'5", 6'6", not the best three-point shooter in the world, but, sort of had to take on the brunt of the offensive load here. In the portal, easily could take a step up and be a very successful contributor for a team that's looking to compete for a national championship next year should he return. So his looming decision, not only whether he'll stay in the NBA draft or not, but where he'll potentially transfer. Obviously being a guy, as I mentioned, who's still, and you mentioned, Greg, who's still in the portal. There's two big things to sort of check off the list there, because he's a guy who, from a lot of the speculation, is receiving tons of high major interest from programs all across the country. There hasn't been a lot of it reported from looking around the landscape of everything the past couple of weeks, but a guy who out of high school visited multiple high major schools, who had several high major programs interested. Again, I mentioned a top 100 prospect, but even in reality, he was a top 20 prospect based on the rankings. And schools like Texas, Arizona, looking back at LSU, was interested as well. So yeah, a guy in Yasuafu who definitely a big looming decision there. And the other guy I think really stands out to me as a big fan of mid-major basketball and someone who covers a ton of mid-major basketball is the decision for Alan Graves coming out of Santa Clara. Not necessarily a school that's producing the most professional talent, but certainly have sent guys to the league over the past couple of years, have some great basketball history in a fantastic conference in the West Coast Conference. But I just think overall, a lot of people sort of, when Graves announced his decision, take a look at the NBA draft waters and test the process there. A lot of people didn't necessarily know his name as well as they should have. I know he went and dropped 17 against Kentucky in the first round of the NCAA tournament in a very close game, but probably wasn't quite a household name like some of the other guys that are entering the process. But a guy who certainly fits that sort of NBA mold profile we've seen out of a lot of big men, 6'9", shot 41% from three-point range, so really a stretch four. He's coming off a freshman year at Santa Clara, so a very young guy too, which obviously in the NBA draft, for those who follow, those younger guys, they tend to fly up in the draft order a little bit more than maybe guys who are a little bit more experienced for a number of different reasons. But so the decision for Graves, a big one looming as well, because similar to Yasuafu, he's available in the transfer portal as well as can still exit the NBA draft to come back to college. A guy who no doubt will have a ton of high major interest. I'd seen Kentucky, was pursuing him.
LSU ironically was too.
Yes, a Louisiana guy. I wouldn't be surprised if, potentially he ends up there. It seems like that's a team who's sort of been interested in throwing some money at him to try and get him to come back to college basketball from what I've read online and different stuff like that. The interesting thing with Graves is he's kind of gone from a guy who was a little bit unheralded entering the draft process. I didn't watch the combine or any of the drills or anything like that, what I've seen on social media and different stuff like that. But from my understanding, a guy who's really climbed up draft board the past couple of weeks or the past month or so, just with his performances at some of the events that they've held in the lead up to the combine. And so I've seen a lot of maybe some different outlets and reporters and such who say maybe Graves might even be, interested in staying in the process. Obviously, he's hung around in the NBA draft process for this long, so he's certainly considering it. I've read that there's maybe some more potential than there was a couple weeks ago for him to stay in the NBA draft pool. So another interesting decision there between those two guys. Both, as I mentioned, eligible in the transfer portal, will likely be at different schools next year should they return to the college basketball landscape. Big looming decisions between those two over the next couple of weeks, as well as a bunch of other guys who I'm sure we'll touch on some of, just with potential decisions to return to college in the coming weeks. And I think we had a couple breaks as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, we did have a few breaks. We know that Ruben Chenyulu is going to be going back to Florida, which I thought was going to be the case all along, but he actually tested out a little bit better at the NBA draft combine than a lot of people expected. And we are noticing quite a few guys are coming back. Morris Johnson is gone, but still, I was sort of expecting that as well. And then I know you do such a great job over at the Portal Report, so I do want to ask you about this because the NBA draft decisions at LSU has really taken center stage. But over the last week or two, have there been a few under the radar moves that you've seen that maybe you like the way that a team is starting to build their roster, and maybe you felt like there was some unfinished business for a team in early May that perhaps they've been able to do some good work on over the last 2, maybe even 3 weeks?
Specifically, I look around sort of the A10, and again, a conference I cover very closely, and we talk about on this show from time to time, I feel like, when we come on here to do some of our mid-major highlights. But I think a month and a half ago, maybe close to 2 months ago, we hopped on here very early in the transfer portal window, and you asked me about some of the early teams thought maybe were a little slow and off the jump in terms of transfer portal recruitment. And if I'm not mistaken, St. Louis was actually one of the teams I mentioned. And I sort of prefaced it by saying they are returning a handful of players from last year, some good talent, but they had just been a little slow in terms of, getting off the mark and bringing in transfer portal talent. And again, I'd prefaced it by saying not only were they returning a few guys, but again, it was St. Louis. They're coming off a pretty historic season for the program, I think it would be fair to say. Josh Schertz is back for another year, and it seemed like they re-upped his deal and has done a very good job there. So they were always going to be able to bring in a couple guys. I just was a little surprised with maybe the slow start we had seen compared to some other teams around the conference. Maybe even like Davidson, who's brought in a handful of guys, even some high major talent, or like Duquesne, who's always, I feel like is constantly rebuilding their roster off-season to off-season, so has a handful of guys coming in from the portal. Even GW, who I think we talked a little bit about on this show as well, is I think bringing in 6 or 7 guys from the portal already, a handful from the high major level, good upside. But St. Louis early on, I was just a little surprised that they hadn't quite bought in a handful of guys, and they still, again, have not bought in a handful of transfers, because again, they are returning some talent, but they do have 2 names on the ledger now in terms of, the incoming transfer portal additions, the 2 being Aloni Mitchell coming over from Colorado and Elijah Strong coming over from South Carolina. So 2 high major guys, but with a ton of upside. I mean, Aloni Mitchell coming over from Colorado, 6'9", sort of in that European big man mold where he's can be a little bit of a stretch 4. It seems like everything I've read about the guy and all the footage I've watched on the guy, I'd be lying if I said I watched a ton of Colorado last year, because Greg, I just don't watch a ton of high major basketball, probably as much as I should or would even like to. Just from all the things I've read and watched about him, a really exciting guy who I think will fit well in Josh Schertz's scheme up front. He's an instant starter piece for them in the front court, after losing Robbie Avila this past offseason, obviously out of eligibility. Piece I think will be really impactful for them, a potential all-conference addition. And obviously just coming from the high major level, a guy bolstering with potential, in a conference like the A10. And then you get to Elijah Strong, a guy who's a little bit more well-traveled. He's been around to a couple different programs over the years, between stints at Boston College, if I'm not mistaken, and South Carolina, and, now rounding out his time with St. Louis. And he's going to bring similar size in the front court to Alone, 6'8", probably a little bit bigger. His stature, I think 6'8", 240 he was listed at last I checked, and going to be more of a dominant front court interior piece. Maybe I don't quite see him as like a slot-in start piece right away, but just a guy who I imagine is going to be, pretty dominant in the A10. We've seen some guys sort of in similar molds over the past couple of years for different programs come in and find a lot of success and dominate right away. So obviously a veteran guy with tons of experience, as I sort of touched on briefly. And so just a 2-man transfer class for St. Louis, but I felt that having come on here probably almost 2 months ago now, and I mentioned St. Louis maybe not having the strongest start in the transfer portal, I thought it would be a little remiss of me, Greg, if maybe I didn't circle back at this point in the window just to highlight, 2 additions that I think could be potentially all conference in the A10, a conference, again, that I cover pretty closely. So excited to see what they can do coming off, really, again, a historic season for the program. Obviously, being able to retain Schertz is huge. But not only that, being able to retain a handful of guys from last year, and then only building on that with a small but impactful transfer class that I think will be very impactful from the get-go.
Yeah, other than Brady Dunlap, they pretty much retained everyone that didn't run out of eligibility, which in this day and age is very, very difficult to do. It's the old Trilly Donovan saying, sometimes the best gets are the ones that you've already got. And St. Louis did a great job in terms of retaining that roster, and we always do a great job trying to retain you as one of our main guests, my friend. Riley, I know you're doing great work over at Mid-Major Madness, the Portal Report, and so much more. So love to get people at home know what's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. Always a pleasure to join you and talk some college hoops, my man. I feel like I say this every time I come on. I certainly don't have the most news coming out right now, but that doesn't mean it isn't an exciting time in college basketball between all these exciting looming decisions and a couple transfer portal hits here and there happening, it seems like, on the daily, and obviously everything going on with the NBA draft. But yeah, so always a pleasure getting to hop on here with you and talk a little bit about all these different situations things and the chaos of the sport right now, it seems. So thank you for your time. But yeah, for those listening at home, you can find me on social media. It's usually at Riley Frain, RILEYFRAIN, as Greg kind of mentioned at the top of the show. I write for Mid-Major Madness and do a lot of reporting for the Portal Report, so my coverage tends to be a little bit more mid-major focused. And then in addition to that, a lot of transfer portal related coverage. Yeah, if you're interested in a lot of that, please come stop by and check it out. We'll have plenty of coverage throughout the summer and everything like that. Of course, lots of stuff as the season starts to ramp up, but I'm sure I'll be back on here with Greg in a couple of weeks at some point talking more about another chaotic situation in college basketball. But yeah, definitely come check it out if you get the chance. And thank you again for having me, Greg. Always a pleasure. It really is.
It always is great to be able to get Riley aboard. He does such a great job keeping his eyes on this great sport of college basketball, no matter how chaotic it may be. And every single time he joins me, well, it's such great insight. So big thanks to Riley for joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the Beast and Family podcast. Up next, I give you a recap of the news and notes we saw in college basketball on Thursday. Here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peters, and now part of the Beast and Family podcast. It's always a pleasure to be joined by Riley Frain, who's doing such amazing work over at the Portal Report, looking at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. Every single time he joins me, he wants such great insights. He did so once again today. So big thanks to Riley for joining me in the last segment. Now it is that time of the podcast. I give you a recap of the news and notes we saw in college basketball over the last 24 hours. This is a huge one for the old Hampton Pirates. It feels like once every few years they land a really big time transfer, and I think that this is a really good one for them. Adam Nanji. You saw him a few years ago over at Iona. During that season over at Iona, he was averaging 12.5 points, 4.2 assists per game. He was supposed to be at Dayton this past season. He was ineligible for some reason. I'm not quite sure what the reason was specifically, but it looked like he was going to be at Dayton. He was not, so he took the year off. He is now heading on over to Hampton. Now, one thing that has been a forte of Hampton is a lack of three-point shooting, and our good friend Mr. Nanji, he was only shooting about 29% from three-point range, but he developed as a starting point guard as a freshman 2 seasons ago, so he's got a lot of upside there. Hampton has really dealt with some, shall we say, lackluster guard play over the last few seasons. They've been very strong down low, but they haven't been able to do a great job with regards to backcourt. He should be able to help out with this. Now, Hampton is still going to need to get some shooting because, man, they just don't have a ton of it, and they're bringing in some nice pieces. Seth Hubbard, he's another guy that's going to be able to help out the offense from UW Milwaukee, but again, not a great three-point shooter. Cornelius Robinson, 6'6" combo player from Monmouth. Aaron Davis comes over from Bryant. Max Frazier, he was a solid player over at Central Connecticut. So I like the pieces that they picked up. Again, it feels like they're going to be good down low. It feels like they're going to be great on the boards. They do need to get a bit more three-point shooting, but certainly I think that Hampton is going to be much more competitive out there in the CAA than they have been in past seasons. Harry Lau, he was over at Pittsburgh. He redshirted this last season, but he was playing previously for the Sydney Kings of the Australian National League. He is going to be adding on over to Long Beach State. He's a 6'7", little bit of a combo, but guy should be able to give this team some three-point shooting, a little bit of help on the boards. Long Beach State was a pretty good team on the defensive boards last season. They really need to improve the way that they took care of the ball last season, but it's very clear that this team is going to be going big. Gigar Bisic, hopefully you got that correct. He comes over from Bucknell at 6'10". Noah Ammenhauser, 7'2" big man. A few seasons ago over at Coastal Carolina was a good rebounder. Jack Payne, the Payne train, coming over from Idaho as a 6'6" combo player. Johan Cisco, he had 6'6", comes over from Florida Atlantic. This team is going big. I don't know who's going to be running point for this team. I don't know who's going to be launching from three, but they are going to try to dominate things down low. Lau should be able to give you a little bit of versatility. That'll help out there, but certainly an interesting decision with regards to that. And I like this pickup as well for Seton Hall. Seton Hall, it feels like they're falling behind some of these teams out there in the Big East, but we saw with Sheen Holloway last year, he's typically able to do a little bit more with less, and they're bringing in a guy that I think is going to be great with the system. Meyer Wool. Last season, he was over at Bowling Green, averaging 10.5 points. At 6'8", only averaged about 2.7 rebounds per game, but he shot 39% from three-point range, had active hands with a steal per game. Seton Hall was one of the best teams in all of college basketball in terms of being able to generate turnovers, and I think that he fits the system well. As we know, Seton Hall the last few seasons have been not great with their three-point shooting, and it's very clear here in the offseason they've been trying to address that, bringing in Kareem Thomas, who was over at Dartmouth. I think that was a good touch. Hot Rod Rodney Brown, who was a nice three-point shooter over at Loyola Marymount. Del Jones comes over from Radford. Roddy Anderson, he comes over from Xavier, began his career over at Boise State. This is a team I think is going to be solid down low. Simeon Wilcher began his career over at St. John's, was a solid player over at Texas this last season. They're picking up guys I think are going to be good defensively. They're certainly going to be able to help this team out with their three-point shooting. I don't know if they're going to be quite as good in the post as they were a season ago, but I'm sure that Shante Leggins is still going to be able to do a rock-solid job there, and I really like what this team is building. For Jackson State, they were solid in their backcourt last season, had absolutely nothing down low whatsoever. They're looking to beef up their defense a little bit, and they bring in a guy that was very solid on defense last year over at Southeast Louisiana, Mekhi Miles. He should be able to help out the three-point shooting as well. As a 6'6" combo player, began his career over at UAB, didn't get a lot of run there, but over at Southeast Louisiana, 7.5 points, 3.5 boards, shot about 34.5% from three-point range, 1.4 steals per game. He should upgrade a Jackson State team that it was just a little bit of a mess last season, and it felt like they were just relying upon Deshaun Ruffin and nobody else the last few seasons, and whenever he was with injury, what have you, it was just an unmitigated mess. They're also bringing in Chip Blunt, who is over in the Southland last season from Northwestern State. They're retaining Dorian McMillan, who was one of their main scorers from a season ago. Bringing in Jaden Williams is going to help them out down low. I like the offseason that Jackson State has had. They're going to be competitive, in my opinion, up there in the SWAC, where it's going to do not necessarily a lot of the world's greatest players, but hey, I do like what they've been able to do. Joe Van Bogent, hopefully I got that correct. He was over at Indiana State last season. He was averaging about 3.1 assists. He was able to throw in there about 6.5 points per contest. He has decided that he is going to be going to Sacred Heart. Sacred Heart needs to work on a little bit of balance because they were a good three-point shooting team last year. They were absolutely awful with regards to their defense. They had a little bit of a tough time taking care of the ball. Now, I will say Boganat, he was a part of an Indiana State offense that they had a tough time taking care of the ball as well, but it was also a part of a team that was really good with regards to their interior defense as well. That's going to be helping them out. Now, he doesn't necessarily have the most ideal size in the world. He's right around about 6'2", 6'3", but for Sacred Heart, even though they're not adding a high quantity of guys right now, I do feel like they've been able to have some relatively solid adds. For Sacred Heart, they are a team that I think is going to be pesky out there in the Metro Atlantic for this upcoming season. I don't know if we can necessarily put them with the contenders or anything like that, but hey, they're bringing in Jalen Robinson, who is a guy over at Richmond that was a nice 6'6", a little bit of a combo player. They also bring in Samson Riley. He was solid over at Quinnipiac this last season. So, like the moves there, they might be taking a step down with their three-point shooting, but they certainly have upgraded and they have prioritized being a little bit better on the defensive end for this upcoming season. You've got Caden Diggs. He was the sixth man of the year out there in the America East last season. He was averaging about 10 points, 4 boards per contest. He has decided that he is going to be joining the men of Troy. Took Troy a little bit of time to be able to get up off the mat. That's what happens when you lose a guy like Scott Cross, and they've been looking a little bit more of the Division II route, but they're already adding in there Robert Davis, a 15-point-per-game scorer 2 years ago over at Old Dominion. They earlier in the week added Jaquay Hutchinson, began his career over at George Washington. Solid defender over at Longwood, not a guy that was really able to light it up from three-point range, but I do like this ad for them, and I do feel like they're getting a lot of balance. Now, I don't think that they're going to be a dominant team down low like they were under Scott Cross, and I do think that Diggs might be able to help out a little bit there. 6'7" combo player, shot about 35.5% from three-point range. Great versatility out there in the Sun Belt. I think that this is a good ad for them. Again, are they going to be back to where they were the last few seasons under Scott Cross? Probably not, but in light of a rough situation, I feel like they're doing a very good job here. This is a good ad for Georgia State. They're adding in their Jaden Jackson. He last season was over at South Dakota State, and he was one of the main men for South Dakota State. He was able to spy that team with about 12.3 points per game. Not an amazing three-point shooter, not awful, about 32.5% from three-point range, able to throw in there 2.5 assists per game. He'll give you a little bit over 4 rebounds per game, and good active hands, steal and a half per contest. He has decided that he is heading on over to Georgia State, and for Georgia State, they've had, in my opinion, a really good offseason. It was just very clear, and I like Jonas Hayes as a coach, but it was just clearly not working out for them, to say the least. They hired on John Cremens in the offseason, who's a very accomplished assistant coach, and he's been able to do a really nice job in terms of adding in there some good guard play. I still do have a little bit of question mark as to what you're going to be able to get down low out of Georgia State, but this is going to be able to help them out with regards to a little bit of stretchability in terms of just versatility in general. They also had in there Zion Wilborn, who was a guy that wasn't necessarily a main guy for Samford, but I think he'll come in right away, give you some production. Eric Parnell, 12-point per game scorer over at Fairleigh Dickinson. Jacob Meyer, he's able to dole it out. He was very solid over at DePaul, UAB, Coastal Carolina, many others. So I like what this team is building. Again, they might be a little bit soft down low, but that guard play is looking very good right now for Georgia State. We've got Isaiah Watts. He was over at Maryland this last season, and he saw some okay minutes for them. He was averaging about 4.5 points per contest. Now, he really was able to have his heyday over at Washington State a few seasons ago. A few seasons ago, when he was over at Washington State, he was supplying that team with about 11 points per game. He's a career 34% three-point shooter. That 11-point per game season, he was shooting more like 35% from three, through in there 1.7 steals, 2.1 assists per game, and he has decided that he's heading on over to UTSA. Meet for the Roadrunners. Finally, they get on the board with something good, and I've always liked Austin Clonch as a coach. Austin Clonch has had a terrible roster this last season, and ever since he got to UTSA, I feel like he just has not done a great job of recruiting, to say the least. Like, when he was over at Nichols, he was always great with his defensive style, active hands, and he certainly is going to be able to fit the defensive system that Clonch has, and I do think that they've had a few guys that can fit that system. J.J. Kelly is an upside guy that comes over from Ohio. Josiah Legree, he comes in from Morehead State. Not necessarily a guy that's going to generate a lot of turnovers, but he'll help run the point. KJ Tenner, he's a 6-footer that comes over from Murray State. He'll help out as well. Now, UTSA really doesn't have anything down low whatsoever. I think that they're going to get decimated on the glass in the American, but this team is going to be based around guard play. They're doubling down on it, so I like what they're doing there. Now, this is one where for UConn, if they're relying upon this man, they're going the wrong way down a one-way street, but hey, you feel good for them. Isaiah Shaw, he was over in Northern Arizona this last year, 8 points, 2 rebounds. Now, he was a 46.5% three-point shooter that was just a nice dynamo for them from outside. He decides that he's going to be going to Connecticut. This is clearly a 11th, 12th man on the roster sort of ad. If they're relying upon Isaiah Shaw for massive minutes in a big-time game, they're having something go horribly, horribly wrong. But that said, they did lose Solo Ball here earlier on in the offseason. But I do think that for UConn, this is going to be a locked and loaded team. They retain so many guys, including obviously Braden Mullins from this past NCAA tournament run, Nicolas Kamina, who comes over from Duke. He's a former top 20 recruit. Niles Malachowski was a good scorer over at Wofford, and now you've got a guy that is going to be able to give them some three-point shooting. Like, I don't think that he's going to be a complete afterthought, but he's going to be a very situational guy. They're probably looking at him more as a depth piece rather than anything else, and maybe more of a developmental guy. But still, I do think that that helps out in terms of filling out the roster. And then you've got Kean Webb. He was over at Portland State this last season, 6'11" big man. He was limited to 4 games due to injury. He was only averaging like a point a game for them. But that said, last we saw him fully healthy, he was averaging more like 3.5 points, 2.5 rebounds per game over at San Diego, and he's decided that he is going to be heading on over to Albany. For Albany, it is a team that's really been dealing with some issues on the glass over the last few seasons. His size alone should be able to help out a little bit on that front. Now for Albany, I still think that it's a little bit of an uphill battle for them out there in the America East. They're not keeping up with the teams like even a UMass Lowell, even a team like a Vermont, who's obviously a really strong team. But now they add in there him along with Ben Michaels, who was very good, ironically enough, at Vermont. Pedro Santos, 6'7" combo player from UT Martin. They right now have absolutely no depth whatsoever, but they're starting to acquire guys that are going to be able to give them a nice starting 5, and I do think that this is a good ad for them. I like this ad as well for UTSA. Going back to the Meet Roadrunners, I just discussed things with them. They had another ad on Thursday that was going a little bit further under the radar. Damari Williams, he was over at Houston Christian this last season, averaging about 9.5 points, 3.5 rebounds per game. This is certainly much less impactful of one than the one that I was mentioning before with bringing in Isaiah Watts, but still, I feel like he's going to be able to play a little bit of a role for the team. Again, with UTSA, it feels like they're going to get decimated on the glass. That said, for Williams, guy that shot about 31% from 3, began his career over at Oral Roberts, should be able to give the team some even further guard depth and perhaps a little bit of a wing possibility at about 6'5" or so. And then you saw this man commit as well as you've got Ty Francis, who was over at Northeastern this last season. He was averaging about 4.5 points, 2.5 rebounds per game. He has decided that he is going to be heading on over to Lemoyne, and for Lemoyne, I think the big thing for them is just being able to improve their ball security. And Northeastern was one of those teams that they had a very difficult time in terms of being able to take care of the ball. But for Francis, in a 6'7", little bit of a wing role, 4.5 points, 2.5 rebounds per game, not a guy that really popped it well from 3-point range. He was shooting less than 30% from 3-point range. And Lemoyne was a good 3-point shooting team last season, but has the versatility to be able to guard multiple positions. For Lemoyne, they were a team that was okay with regards to their interior play last season, and I think that this is probably going to be a little bit more of a depth piece than anything else. They bring in Khalil Williams from Bryan. Jaden Teat is a guy that I really like coming over from Sacramento State. Demaine King, he was over at UT Martin. He's going to help out the defense. Jeremy Clayville, he saw some good minutes over at NJIT for Lemoyne. It feels like it's going to be a lot of role players. They don't necessarily have that main guy, but they have built themselves some relatively nice depth, so I do like what they're doing on that front. And hopefully you're enjoying what I'm doing on the front of this podcast. If you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, Lars they mean does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it's very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. Big thanks once again to Riley Frain. He does such great work over at the Portal Report, Mid-Major Madness, and so much more. He joined me in the last segment. Once we get things a little bit more solidified with these rosters, I'm going to give you guys a conference preview podcast for all 32 of these podcasts. We need to get set for what I hope to be the greatest season of college basketball ever, and then once we get back in season, picks and analysis on every single game, every single day. So I appreciate you tuning in today, and I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.